by the go-to authority in the field of insider politics. I'm delighted that you're here. And for those of you that I've not had the pleasure of meeting, I'm Randy Garcia, the Chief Executive Officer of the Investment Counsel Company. Thank you. You really know how to make a guy feel good. I'm also the proud founder of one of the nation's first fiduciary wealth management firms in 1987. And the reason I make this point is because that is a voluntary commitment in placing the client's welfare first by avoiding all conflicts of interest. And still, this is not the industry requirement. A standard of client service that was not embraced nor understood at the time. Our company strives to serve as a thought leader in providing access to the nation's top experts, to broaden awareness, perspective, and gain a more accurate understanding on matters important to you. As you know, today is one of the most important holidays in America, Veterans Day. And I'd like to call up United States Air Force retired Brigadier General Greg Eide.
Randy, thank you for the opportunity to speak to our veterans and our guests this evening. If there are any veterans in the audience, would you please rise if able? To all you veterans, and especially your families, on behalf of the Investment Counsel Company and our guests, we thank you for your courage, sacrifice, and unwavering devotion that have helped shape the freedoms our country enjoys today. We are forever grateful for your service and dedication to help maintain our country's freedom, that we are in your debt forever. Thank you. Thanks, Randy.
Thank you for your distinguished service to our nation as well, General Eide. Before this evening's speaker is introduced, I think it's also important to recognize some other individuals present in our audience who are making a profound positive difference among our youth in Southern Nevada. Dr. Dave Loeb and his students, with support from Dr. Nancy Usher, Dean of the UNLV College of Fine Arts, have received the #1 ranking among all university jazz bands in America year after year. And Dr. Daniel Chi, chairman of UNLV's finance department, and his students just returned from a week on Wall Street, meeting with prominent companies to gain a stronger understanding of career opportunities in our industry. And Dr. Jag Mehta, finance professor, recently funded and launched UNLV's first investment fund to give our students a real-life experience in securities portfolio management. And Dr. Lisa Menegaudos, Dean of UNLV's Honors College, will be taking her students to Nevada's legislature in Carson City to help them understand and experience how a bill becomes law. And Danny Siciliano, doctor in accountingology, has successfully led his students in national competition in managerial accounting to #1 in our nation as well. And finally, Dr. Marta Miana, former interim UNLV president and former dean of the Honors College, has successfully guided our university through some of the most difficult challenges in the institution's history, including COVID, as well as some of the university's greatest successes, including UNLV gaining Carnegie R1 status as a top-tier research university. I would appreciate it if you'd help me in thanking them for their inspiring commitment to excellence in education. If you'd please stand. Professors, please stand so we can acknowledge you. Dr. Miana, Dave Loeb, all the professors over there, thank you again. My co-MC this evening has served our state and our country with honorable distinction. He is two-term Nevada governor and two-term U.S. Senator Richard Bryan. Many others believe, as I do, that he's not just the most respected, but also the most admired politician in the history of Nevada. Please help me welcome Senator Bryan.
I wish you'd given me that kind of introduction when I was running for office. Yeah. Randy and I met more than 4 decades ago. I was governor of Nevada, and the taxi cab authority was one of the most contentious agencies. Some of you old-timers will recall that in 1969, we had the taxi cab wars down here. Individuals were hurt, one was killed, and so the taxi cab authority was a very important agency. And Randy agreed to accept my appointment. Now, at the time, there were some people, there are always naysayers, as we know, who said, "What in the hell did you do in appointing this young guy to this job? This is a big job." Well, the rest is history. He's done a remarkable job in each of the steps he's taken in his career. And little did I know that in 2001, when I left my job in Washington, D.C., with a tin cup in hand, Randy took me in, and I'm also a client of Randy's and happy to be. Now, we've just had a very contentious election, and whether you are to the right of the Sheriff of Nottingham or to the left of Mao Zedong, there is one man in the audience that deserves some recognition. There was a time when, being the Secretary of State, nobody knew who they were or what they did, but that's no longer the case. One of their major responsibilities in our democracy is to run a fair election and a free election. Cisco Aguilar, who joins us tonight, successfully accomplished that in the recently election that we've all had. Cisco, would you stand up and just take it a while? Now, my real purpose here tonight is to introduce a remarkable individual. Some, I think, have heard him before, but he is a person who has followed the scene in Washington for more than 4 decades and been reporting on it. He specializes in coverage of economic issues, taxes, the Federal Reserve, and all of that sort of thing. He brings a unique perspective to us this evening, providing regular commentary and insight into Washington for financial services, investment management clients worldwide. Greg is a frequent guest on Fox, CNN. Now, that's quite an accomplishment in itself. I saw that, I said, this must be a hell of a guy that can do this. Greg is a frequent guest, as I've indicated, on these networks, and he's also frequently quoted in the Wall Street Journal, Barron's, and the Washington Post. Would you please join me in welcoming tonight's guest, Greg Valliere. Greg?
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Well, I must start with asking you a favor, and that is to indulge me as I sit, since I blew my back out about a week and a half ago. I don't recommend blowing your back out. It's not a lot of fun, and even the drugs aren't any good. So it's been a difficult stretch. For about 50 years, I ran 4 or 5 times a week, and I would say now, stretch every day you run. It makes a difference. Well, a lot to talk about this evening. I've never been a big believer in long evening speeches, so I'll keep this to about 20 minutes, maybe 25, and then we'll have some questions. A lot has happened, obviously. I guess we have to start by asking the question, what the heck happened last week? Good Lord, this was, I wouldn't say it was quite a landslide, but it was awfully close to a landslide. And I would have to say that this is going to have implications, and it's not just about transgender. Somebody asked me today, what about the transgender issue? I don't think a lot of people care about that, but there are issues that certainly have been tossed about quite a bit. So in looking at what happened last Tuesday night, there's 2 or 3 things I'd throw out, and then I want to spend most of the time talking about what comes next. We already know what happened. I think need to look at what comes in the next year or two. But just a bit of a postmortem. I would say that when Kamala Harris writes her book, she'll probably concede that she was not serious enough or motivated enough to do much with the immigration story. Right around Christmas 2 years ago, we were having 1 million people a week coming into the U.S. Without anyone stopping them. Why this happened, why the White House was so indifferent, will be a subject for quite some time. And then there's crime. I live in Washington, D.C., where it seems like every weekend you have a dozen carjackings, some violent. Not a great way to live, and I live in downtown Washington, D.C. That's been an issue too, and I think we've seen in states like California in the last few days a real turn, a real pushback by the voters of California who have said enough is enough. Then there's inflation. I think inflation was one of the great issues that never really got talked about seriously. The White House and Joe Biden, and I don't hate Biden, I'm right on the 50-yard line on most issues, but the White House kept saying inflation is coming down. That wasn't accurate. Inflation was rising less rapidly. That's a big, big difference. And inflation has risen less rapidly, but it certainly hasn't gone down, and I don't think that's imminent. And then finally, to me, the biggest surprise of all, the biggest story of all, in looking at what happened, looking back, is a gaffe that was made by Kamala Harris when she said on a talk show that she couldn't think of anything different that she could have done better than Biden. That outraged the Democrats. She never really got over that gaffe. Of all people, James Carville today said that basically ruined her campaign by saying that she and Biden were essentially the same. So both sides made gaffes. Both sides, I think, have things to answer for, but there were a lot of things that I think could have been done a lot better. Very hard to read in the light here. So what happens next? What happens next? Well, first of all, in my city, everybody's got their resume out. I mean, you walk down the street, you'd be hit by somebody reading somebody else's resume. I think it was Andrew Jackson, the senator, probably has read about this. No, I know you weren't friends, but I would say you probably have read about Jackson and others who had lobbyists all the time talking about what they had on their resumes. And that'll probably continue with some interesting names. Probably the most respected name I've seen so far is Marco Rubio. I think he can have almost any job he wants. He's maybe a bit too moderate for some Republicans, but I think Rubio is on the short list for Secretary of State or Treasury, a high-ranking job like that. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is on the list. He wants to redo the Food and Drug Administration. I have my doubts about him. He's someone who, lest we forget, during the summer announced that he had been infected by a parasitic worm that ate part of his brain. And that's a sort of, a lot of people went, excuse me, is that for real? But you'll have him in the mix as well. But let's talk about some of the issues. I want to spend most of my time talking about big issues that for investors I think are important. First of all, the issue I always consider among the very top in Washington is monetary policy. And I think that is going to continue to be a very big deal. I think there is friction between Trump and Jerome Powell. They don't get along. Trump, I'm told, has said to people he'd like to fire Jerome Powell, but Powell's term continues until 2006. So I think it would be difficult to fire him. I suppose Trump could call up Powell and say, I want you out. I don't like your policies, I don't like your neckties, I want you out. It's possible, but I think Powell would resist. Trump also is talking about a president being on the board of the FOMC, the Federal Open Market Committee, which sets interest rates. And Trump has stated in private, I am told, that he wants to be a voting member of the FOMC and have a vote on interest rates. Needless to say, at the Fed, they are apoplectic over something like this happening to a very independent agency. So there's going to be friction. I think the friction between the two of them will persist. But Powell has a weapon, and that weapon, of course, is his ability to cut rates. So we'll talk about that in a little while. But I think rates are coming down more. For those of you thinking of buying real estate or cars or whatever, I think we are getting closer and closer to more interest rate reductions, a very positive story. I will be giving you several positive themes, and that's a big one, that Powell, I think, wants to see rates come down. As far as other issues, there's no end to the issues that we had during the presidential campaign. I think that the president has made a big deal of saying, drill, baby, drill. That's been his mantra. It's a catchy mantra, but I'm beginning to wonder. This is a contrarian view. I'm beginning to wonder, could we overdo it? Could there be too much of a good thing? Since Biden has produced more energy than any president in U.S. history, and you have others saying we have to resurrect the Keystone Pipeline, and you see more and more of the Trump people saying they want to have more energy produced. I just wonder if we perhaps are going to do too much. For now, it remains to be seen, but I talked to a lot of people in the industry who are concerned that we might actually do too much. There certainly will be a lot of indifference on regulatory policy. Had Harris won, I think regulatory policy would have been very aggressive, but she didn't win. And I think you'll see, an environment where only a few regulatory issues will get a lot of attention. One would be AI. AI, I think, will get some attention on Capitol Hill, but I would say that most members of Congress, I'm sorry to say this, but most members of Congress have no idea what the internet is, let alone AI, or no idea what Wi-Fi is. My guess is that there's a very laissez-faire regulatory climate that's coming, and I think that is a really positive story for the markets, as we've seen recently. But there are three big issues. The three big issues I want to spend a little bit of time on is, number one, the deficit. We have to talk about that. Number two, taxes. And number three, geopolitics. Those are the three, in my opinion, those are the three big issues that will be dominant over the next few months. So let's take the most serious one. And I talked to my friend and expert, the senator, earlier this evening about the appalling U.S. budget deficit, which shows no sign of abating. We're in an environment now where in the fiscal year that ended about 5 weeks ago, the deficit came in at just under $2 trillion. $2 trillion in a year where the economy was pretty good. God forbid we had a weak economy and the deficit would be even higher. I travel all around the country. I see great groups like this group. I prefer to stand rather than sit, but as I travel around the country, I'm constantly bombarded by people who say, why can't we do something about the deficit? Are we that incompetent that we can't really take a shot at reducing it? And my answer is, I don't think so. I mean, you ask these very well-intended people what they would do. What would your prescription be? Would you cut Social Security? Absolutely not. Could you cut taxes? I don't think so. Could you have an environment where Social Security got cut, Medicare got cut, on and on and on? None of these prescriptions have much support. And the idea of raising taxes to reduce the deficit has very little support as well. You have a president who wants more tax cuts. You've got Democrats who love to spend. So I think that the deficit is going to continue to be a problem. Now you may ask, and I'm going to ask the senator in a few minutes, but you may ask, so what? Is it that big a deal? I would say that the credit rating agencies, S&P, Fitch, all of these credit rating agencies that judge the U.S. debt may start to get nervous. And they may begin to think that we need to curb our spending, or at the least show that Congress has some desire to level off on the amount of spending that we're doing. I don't think it's going to happen. Maybe there'll be a little bit. Maybe we'll see in this new Congress, and it looks like the House and Senate both will be Republicans, maybe we'll see a little bit of deficit reduction, but I fear that the deficit is going to continue around $1.5 trillion a year as it keeps going up and up and up. So at some point, there'll be a catalyst. Maybe it'll be an angry market. Who knows? But at some point, I think the country will begin to say enough is enough. So that's the first big issue. The second big issue is taxes. And most politicians, feel that taxes are like catnip. They love to seeing tax cuts, and I think there will be a huge debate in Congress over the Trump tax bill, the tax bill of 2017, which expires at the end of this coming year. And I do think there will be more tax cuts that Trump will prevail with over many issues. I think you'll see tax cuts for the wealthy. I think you'll see tax cuts for virtually everything Trump looks at. Salaries, Las Vegas is part of the debate, as you know. So I think that Trump is determined to get significant tax cuts done during the year. The possible roadblock, of course, would be if some members of Congress, maybe 60 in the Senate, say, you just can't keep cutting taxes by this much. There has to be some sign of discipline. But I feel pretty confident in predicting there will be tax reduction to this year. It may not be a huge tax cut, but it'll be plenty big enough. And I think the concern in the bond market could start to grow that we've done too much. Let's talk about the other big issue in terms of the agenda, and that, of course, is geopolitics. Not a lot bothers me at night. People say, what keeps you awake at night? I always say, enlarged prostate. That's the basic. That's the basic. So when you look at things to keep you awake at night, you have to worry about 2 or 3 global hotspots. Let's start with Ukraine. I think that Zelensky knows he's in trouble. I think that he has to worry that more and more countries are beginning to lose their fervor, lose their ardor for more aid to Ukraine. I think that more and more people in the West, Canada, the US, Western Europe, are beginning to say, we can't spend $60 billion a year on Ukraine. We don't have that kind of money. And a lot of conservatives in the US, young conservatives especially, are saying, we got our own problems. We can't spend that kind of money on Ukraine. So I have to think that Putin is salivating at the prospect of having this lack of resolve on Ukraine. And I do think that this is going to be a growing issue this year. If there's one big stumbling block in Ukraine, it's basically the fact that there's not any desire by any of these Western countries to do very much. And I think Putin has to look at Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, countries that may become more vulnerable as the money starts to dry up. One important point I'd make on Ukraine, and that is, I can't see a resolution unless there's something significant on Crimea. Putin views Crimea as sacred. Zelensky views Crimea as sacred. And it's going to be hard to get a deal. Maybe there'll be a partition like East Germany, West Germany, North Korea, South Korea, but it's going to take a lot of work. And meanwhile, the winter has begun. I have a friend at the Pentagon who says that within the Pentagon, the consensus is that probably 200,000 Russian troops have died, maybe 150,000 Western troops, Ukrainian troops have died. These are horrific numbers, and it shows no sign of ending anytime soon. Then you have the next great crisis, obviously in Gaza, where I think personally what we're going to be looking at is a guerrilla war. maybe not all-out war, but a guerrilla war led by Hamas against Israel that I think will persist. Trump says he can end this war in a day. Trump says he can end the Ukraine war in a day, which I would consider aspirational, frankly. But I do think that you could see this conflict in Gaza persist for quite some time with one very, very big angle. And that angle, of course, is the Iranians. The great provocateurs in that part of the world are the Iranians. They give money to Hamas, to Hezbollah, to the Houthis. We had a big dust-up yesterday with the Houthis. So that's going to continue, in my opinion. What worries me is that the Iranians are working feverishly on a nuclear bomb, a crude nuclear bomb, which could ruin your entire afternoon. And I think the presence of a crude bomb in that neighborhood would be viewed as totally unacceptable by the Israelis. So this is going to be a big issue, whether it's for Trump or whomever, over the next 7 or 8 years, to see just how far the Iranians feel that they can go. I'm not quite as gloomy on China. I think Xi has enough on his plate to avoid going into Taiwan. I think it's not out of the question, but it's not imminent. Trade friction will persist. And I would be remiss if I didn't spend a minute on tariffs. Tariffs are going to be a really big deal, tariffs especially against China. I spent a lot of time in Canada. There are going to be tariffs on Canada and several other countries. So even though I don't see World War III with China, I do think that tariffs are going to be a big issue. Frankly, I think they're a dumb idea. Strong message to follow. But I think that tariffs are inflationary. I think tariffs invite retaliation. I think tariffs are basically a bad idea that will just make inflation go up even higher. So there are things to worry about, but I would have to say it's important to recognize just how strong the U.S. economy is. During this last year, everyone was saying, oh my God, we're going to have a recession that's coming. There's a guy named Larry Summers, you may have heard of, a former Treasury Secretary. Every couple of weeks he said, oh, we're going to have a recession, we're going to have inflation, it's going to come. It never came. Despite all of his pessimism, we never had a problem like that, and I don't see it now. Everybody asks me when I travel, are we going to have a recession? My answer is, no, the economy is okay. It's slipped a bit, but maybe the most important story is that we have medicine from the Fed, as I mentioned earlier. So I think this Federal Reserve is poised for more rate cuts just to make sure the economy doesn't slide. I think there's a very good opportunity to get a 25 basis point rate cut by Christmas, maybe another 25 basis points by the end of the winter, maybe another 25 basis points by spring. I think that you're going to see rates come down. I think that's going to be one of the big stories, as we domestically at least, as we look at 2025. And I think that will keep the economy in pretty good shape. A lot of other issues that I want to get out, but I have my 20-minute rule. We're probably getting close to that. For an evening speech, I always think that's more than enough. So I would just conclude by saying it's been a volatile year, but look at the good news. I mean, I, like many people, was quite apprehensive about political instability. Last week, rioting in the streets and talk of voter fraud, that never happened. So once again, my rule of thumb, if I ever had a chance to write a book, I would write a book about my rule of thumb, and that is things are not as bad as people say they are, especially the media. Don't even get me started on poll takers. I could spend the whole night on poll takers and their inaccuracies. But I would say that things are not that bad. The economy is not that bad. We didn't have riots in the streets. I think things turned out pretty well. At some point in the next year, 2, 3, we're going to have to worry about the Middle East. I concede that. But I think for the next year or two, the outlook for the markets, and my dear friend, Randy, who is one of the class acts in our industry, I think the outlook is quite good. So I'm going to stop there. And we'd love to take some questions, and maybe starting with the senator, who we have talked a lot about when it comes to budget deficits and what it means for the economy. So I'll turn it over to the senator.
Yeah, I would ask it when. It's a when.
Remarkable. Thank you so much, Greg. I struggled in college with Econ 201. I don't want to. Thank God nobody along the political trail ever asked me, how did you do in college? The answer is I signed a non-disclosure agreement with my professors, never to tell anybody how I did in college. Greg, you talked about, you know, the elephant in the room. The campaigns were vigorous. The candidates addressed every conceivable issue, but none of them, Democrat or Republican, addressed the question of what I think is an unsustainable, ongoing deficit. For those of us who the shadows are lengthening for, we're going to be okay. But like so many of you, I have children and grandchildren, and I worry a lot about them. How can we address this? How can we do it? You know, Shakespeare had a quote that I've often used. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves. How do we energize the American public, which obviously, hey, the cost of eggs, the cost of meat, the cost of rent, those are legitimate issues and are affecting millions of people. And in my humble opinion, that was one of the issues that decided the election. But how do we address that? I mean, how do we get a handle on that? Because politically, I've had a little experience in this. You know, you don't get a rousing round of applause when you go out there and say, let me tell you about the taxes I want to increase this next time, you know. Or you don't go to the senior citizen homes in America and say, look, you're going to have to bite the bullet. We're going to reduce Medicare and Social Security. Those are big ticket items, as I understand. So I know you've got the answer that America is waiting for, and this group will be the first to hear it. Greg, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yep. Yeah, you ask people as you travel around, and nobody wants to take a bite out of any kind of discipline. Nobody wants any kind of spending cuts at all. And at some point, you know, maybe it's 4 years, 5 years, 6 years from now, at some point this is going to catch up with us. So I think we're going to take some yeah.
So, and the question I think the senator also and I want to ask was when will the White House and Congress address this issue? But when you ask questions, if you'd like to raise your hand, we have several people here with microphones that'll run to you, and Greg will repeat the question for the benefit of all of us before he responds. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you, Randy. Questions? All right, well, let me start with a rant. I love to rant, especially after a drink or two. I haven't had one tonight, but let me just start with a rant, and that is the vice presidential running mates. I still don't understand why Kamala Harris didn't take the astronaut, who I think is first rate, highly distinguished fighter pilot, but the senator did not get picked. She went with a football coach instead. I also question J.D. Vance. He may grow into the job. We shall see. But when I looked at the two of them, my immediate reaction was, this is the best they can do? And apparently it was. Let's see if we can get some questions going. Yep.
Greg, one, I think, issue that affects us all, certainly here in Southern Nevada and across the country, is some domestic policy issues.
Yep.
And we've continued to see the polarity of issues with poverty and homelessness grow in this community and grow across the country. And certainly many of us are very familiar, spend time in California, and we see the growth of homelessness and poverty and really instability in some of the lower areas of the economy. Do you think the president and the administration and Congress will address some of that domestic issue, or will they kick the can?
Usually with a question like that you have to conclude they'll kick the can. But I have to say, though, statistics have shown over the last 2 or 3 years an improvement in poverty. and poverty looks a little less frightening than it did 3 or 4 years ago. It still is a problem. I would be naive to say it wasn't a problem. But in many states, the economies have improved quite a bit. Other questions? Yeah. The woman right down here.
Thank you. Could you go over your statement that tariffs are inflationary
Yep.
and run through that, please?
Yeah, most economists, 80% would agree that tariffs are a bad idea. That doesn't mean they're right. In fact, if 80% of economists agree on something, I'd probably worry more than anything else. But no, I mean, you look at, if China gets hit with a 40% tariff, Trump has talked about this, if China gets hit with a tariff of that magnitude, China will retaliate. They'll come right back at us. And then if China retaliates, maybe we'll retaliate. And you go back and forth. I date myself, I age myself, but there was something called the Smoot-Hawley Act a long, long time ago that exacerbated inflation. So I do think that is, I do think that's a big concern. And I would say also, lots of tariffs, I would say, would be a headwind for the overall economy. The overall economy is pretty good. And I know a lot of people disagree, but I think the overall economy is in pretty good shape. I would worry that new tariffs would simply be a headwind, would slow the economy rather than increase it. There are some members of Congress who think that tariffs might be a good idea. So I can't say it's a unanimous view in Congress, but I'd say the overwhelming majority is that it's not a great idea. Other questions?
Sir? Just to actually, Bloomberg reporting that Rubio will probably be the next Secretary of State. I know you mentioned him. But actually, I'm interested about what you think about BRICS. And it seems like it's expanding every year. And also, when we lose, they're trying to basically eliminate the petrodollar. I know they want to put new bonds into RMB and all that. What could that do to our deficit?
You said new RICS? I missed
BRICS.
that.
BRICS.
Risks?
BRICS. Brazil, Russia, India,
right.
China,
Yep.
South Africa.
I think they're going to be a concern. No question about it. I think that, just to go to what you said earlier, I'm not surprised to hear that Rubio was nominated tonight or is about to be nominated. I think he's first rate. In Congress, he has a solid reputation. I thought he would have made a great vice presidential candidate, but it didn't work out. So no, I think that it makes a lot of sense to have Rubio. But as far as these emerging countries, yeah, that's going to be a concern. But I get people saying, well, what about the dollar? Isn't the dollar going to get weak at some point? Won't China become the dominant player? I disagree strongly. After what we've seen in the last week, in the last election, I think, if anything, the dollar is going to get stronger against those currencies. Other questions? Oh, there's a gentleman down here, and then we'll take the people in the back. Yes? Thanks.
If President-elect Trump came to you and asked you, please help me to reduce the deficit, tell me what to do.
Can we what?
Tell me what to do to reduce the deficit.
Can we afford to? Sure. I think you could start off modestly. I mean, you don't have to cut spending by 40%. I mean, you could have a minor cut in COLAs, cost of living adjustments. You could have a minor tax hike, a very small tax hike, but you could incrementally improve the deficit. The one thing I didn't mention that I probably should have is stronger growth. I mean, stronger economic growth is probably the magic answer. Unfortunately, right now we're already growing at about 2%. I'm not sure we'll be able to grow a lot more, but if we did see more vibrant economic growth, that would be a tremendous plus, a tremendous plus. if we could see the economy growing faster. I saw a hand in the back.
I want to ask a question. You always mention the word deficit, but not debt. So
Yeah.
is the problem a deficit or debt? And why should I worry about lending money to a government that can always print money? And I'm going to squeeze another question real quick, is why all these years we didn't have inflation. Looking back, what were the major factors that caused inflation over the last 2 years? Thank you.
Well, I think inflation was more moderate in those days. I think now we spend money like drunken sailors. I mean, you look at the money spent at the end of the pandemic, you look at the money spent by Biden, they spent way too much money, more money than was spent during the 60s, 70s. In the 60s, of course, we had the Vietnam War. But once we got out of that, the economy grew well without a huge amount of inflation. As far as the government, yeah, I mean, it's a very valid issue that is the government prepared to handle this deficit problem responsibly? No. And I'll be bipartisan here this evening. I think the excessive spending and excessive tax cuts are a problem for both parties. Certainly a problem for Trump as well as Harris. Both of them refused to talk about discipline. And it shocked me at the Democrats' convention. It shocked me when I saw Trump's speeches. Neither of them wanted to even discuss the deficit. And it's sort of like if you're an alcoholic and you don't even want to talk about it, that's not a good sign. And I think at some point the public is going to have to get angry, but we're certainly not there yet. We're in a celebratory mood right now, and we'll probably stay that way for a while. Other questions? Yep.
Talked about.
Oh, I can't hear. Can you get the microphone?
You talked about problems in the Middle East, and we know that the country is getting a little tired of being the, well, let's say the payload, the payroll clerk for the rest of the world. You didn't touch upon China's growth in the Navy. Its Navy is now, I understand, larger than our own Navy. And you have Japan and that part of the Far East that's very concerned whether Taiwan is going to be around. Do you have any feeling about that?
Well, it's a very complicated issue, and I did mention China, but it's a very complicated issue, and I think that we can't abdicate. We cannot abdicate. One of many great sayings by Margaret Thatcher was that this is no time to go wobbly, and I think she made a lot of sense in saying that, because if we went wobbly and started to waver in our commitment, this would be would make Putin ecstatic. Putin, I think, is starting to realize that he's losing a lot of his young people. They're going to Helsinki and other cities. I think that Putin knows that he's in trouble. And I think that this is no time to abdicate. I think we're going to have to continue. Now, I may be in a minority right now. I can't exaggerate my admiration for the people who served, the people who got up and deservedly got an applause. But if we were to abdicate globally, I think the implications would be very, very unnerving for the rest of the world. There are a lot of countries, not just Russia, China, and North Korea. There's a lot of other countries that hate us. And the one country, as I said, I made a bad joke, but as I said earlier, what keeps me awake is definitely the Iranians. The Iranians are almost incapable of being negotiated with. And I think that's going to continue, and I think we're going to have to keep spending money. We're almost at $100 trillion on defense spending. I think defense spending is going to stay very, very strong.
Hello, Greg.
Other questions? Oh, I can't hear.
Hello.
I can't hear, I can't walk, I can't. Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
You're one of the great investors of our generation. Now, Warren Buffett, prior to this upswing, sold billions of dollars. What are you investing in right now?
What am I investing in?
Yes, please.
I'm investing in my dear friend Randy Garcia. No, I'm an old guy. I look at dividend stocks. I mean, I'm not going to do an Elon Musk type of investment. But no, there are a lot of really, really smart people in our industry, and all kidding aside, Randy is one of them. So I would listen to his advice before you listen to mine. AI. It's a controversial issue. It's an issue where some people feel we could overdo it and that could abuse people. My sense is that it probably won't go that far. There'll be a pushback at some point. I think there'll be a lot of investors who start to worry about how excessive it is. And frankly, I think a lot of people may start to worry about Elon Musk. So let me just another rant, for about 30 seconds on Elon Musk. This is all off the record, right? He has been an unabashed abuser of drugs. He's a strong supporter of not just like a brownie or a glass of red wine. I mean, he's a strong, unabashed supporter of drug use. The Wall Street Journal has done several articles about his clique in Silicon Valley. And they all like to expand their minds, find themselves. What's the meaning of life? I don't have the luxury, probably most of us don't have the luxury to indulge in that, but Musk has. And Musk has admitted his drug use. So that leaves me cold. You know, if you see him tomorrow, is he straight? Is he high? I don't know. I have no idea. But I think that we could get a little too exotic with who we look at for our investments. I'm more of a Warren Buffett meat and potatoes investor. I think that Elon Musk and AI is just a little too rich for me. Other questions? This is a good workout here. Yep.
You kind of touched a little bit what I was going to ask on Elon Musk. He seems to be Trump's new best friend.
Yep.
He did come out and say that he thought retired people shouldn't be taxed. I do love that idea. But I have two questions, actually. What part do you think Elon Musk is going to play in the administration? My second question is about Ukraine, because at one point Trump said Putin was smart when he invaded Ukraine. So where do you think we're going to go from there?
Well, first of all, your first question was on Elon Musk. I think that he and Trump will stay close until their inevitable falling out. So do we take odds in this city? I think the odds are at some point they will have a dispute. Trump has had a dispute with just about everyone who's worked for him, including General Kelly, was a great American for all of the veterans here. General Kelly is a great man, and he made a great sacrifice in his family. So I think there'll be a rift, obviously. And the thing is, Elon Musk, like Trump, is a narcissist, can't get enough publicity. So I think that relationship probably at some point will sputter. But maybe not right away. This could be a bromance that could last for some time. Your other question was Ukraine. Yeah, you know, I think that we have to be vigilant in Ukraine. We can't, I just reiterate what I said earlier, you just can't give up and say, all right, well, we don't want to spend the money in Ukraine. I just think that the Russians who are launching an assault like right now, the Russians are launching an assault that I think could end badly for the West. So, you know, call me old-fashioned, but I think a war, an all-out war that could jeopardize Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, even Poland. I think that's very unnerving and would send the exact wrong signal to Putin.
You could also make an argument that Joe Biden sent the exact wrong signal in Afghanistan to Putin. We got out of Afghanistan very hastily, and it was half-assed, sorry for my language, but it was a half-assed withdrawal from Afghanistan. Do we really want to do that again? I think we have to hold the line. Other questions? The gentleman over here. Oh, I'm sorry, can you?
Would you personally invest in cryptocurrency?
In cryptocurrency? Not me, no. No, I'm an old guy, so I would not invest in. I like to sleep well at night, so I don't think, I probably wouldn't. But I have a lot of friends in this industry who are increasingly enamored of this. And I'd defer to Randy, who knows far more about this than I do. So I'm sure you guys have all asked him about it. But for me, no, not my cup of tea.
Hello, Craig. Thank you for taking our questions tonight. I'm going to try to parrot back something that you said earlier that I have a little bit of difficulty, not juxtapositioning my thinking, but more in terms of how the financial end of it works.
Yep.
You mentioned earlier that Western Europe and the United States and Canada and New Zealand are throwing in $60 billion against Ukraine and Russia.
Yep.
Now, given that we're on the 33rd month of the invasion of Ukraine, how is it, in your opinion, that given all the sanctions, given everything that Russia has been penalized with, that it has a sustainability to still have a war? And let's go back to the old days when Ronald Reagan said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall." We know that at that time the United States spent enough money to bankrupt them. How is it, in your opinion, that Russia still has a prevailing ability to still continue this geopolitical war?
Great question. Well phrased. I think that it could come to an end. I would say, let's see how Donald Trump does. I mean, he's been quite outspoken. I mean, saying he'd end the war in one day is an exaggeration, but I think he does have aspirations of ending the war quickly. I think he feels that if he doesn't, it would be a blowback against him, a pushback against him. So I think that he would view this as a litmus test of his administration, and I think that Putin, who's 71 or 72, I'm told, this is not a joke, I'm told that he has a food taster. I would if I were him. But I do think that the losses in Russia have been enormous, just astonishing losses that he's suffered. But it's a very good question, and I must admit, one of the things I enjoy the most about going on the road and seeing groups like this is to get sort of a sense of where people are. I get the sense that there's a lot of reluctance against staying in Ukraine or aiding Ukraine even more. It's an interesting angle that I hadn't thought through. So thank you. Appreciate it. Other questions?
Going back on the inflation discussion.
Yep.
Talking about how the inflation rate is rising at a slower rate.
Yep.
You have tariffs threatening some push against inflation further.
Yep.
And Chairman Powell's mandate to decrease rates here in the near term. That seems like a tug of war. Who wins?
Yeah, it's a good question. So here's what I'd say. I think that there still is inflation, and I've been out on a limb on this, and I have no problem being on a limb. I say there still is an inflation problem. It's a wage inflation problem. You look at wages, you look at the longshoremen, they just settled. You look at Boeing, they just had a huge settlement. You look at all of these settlements, all of these pressures around the United States for higher salaries. So I would say that wage inflation is far from over. It has not been subdued at all. And I would argue, unsuccessfully probably, but I would argue that Jerome Powell runs a risk of overdoing it. That we got a good economy, everything looks okay. We really want to cut rates another 2, 3, 4 times? Why? I don't think it's necessary. So I would agree with your premise.
I'm going to ask a futuristic question. So you have a lot of wisdom and a lot of experience. So what advice would the Greg of today give the Greg as he was starting out that would still apply to the youth in today? Because Randy deals with a lot of intergenerational wealth. So what good advice would you have for the youth of today?
The youth of today. Get an education. I think that's crucial. Stop smoking weed. I think that's. I think we've gone way overboard on that. Appreciate the sacrifices that people have made for all of us, so we can have freedom. I think that sometimes is overlooked. It's a very entitled generation, feeling that they don't have to do some of the things that I think are necessary. I'll leave it at that, but I would like to see young people more patriotic. And,
Hi.
And maybe because I'm an old grouchy guy, I'd like to see them cut back on the weed, okay?
Amen. And I have a question. I know you may feel that it hasn't brought much attention here, but I did street ministry for 5 years. I know things happen in life that puts you in a bad position and
Yep.
you end up in a tent.
Yep.
But there are also concerns about all these illegal immigrants coming across our border so that we can't approach a solid economic stability if we keep doling out money and putting them in high-rent hotels and giving them food cards and
Yeah.
whatever. It's a concern. Are they going to close the border?
Great question. Again, I've gotten a lot of great questions. I think that it sounds harsh, and I'm not like some right-wing fanatic, but I think that there has to be a more aggressive move against fentanyl. I travel all around the country, and in much of the country, including my home state of New Hampshire, of all places, there's a fentanyl crisis. It's not just Prince or Tom Petty or lots of people who toyed with this. It's a lot of people who have died of fentanyl. And I think that there's going to have to be a crackdown. It may not be pretty. I don't like seeing families broken up, but we can't continue like this. There's going to have to be some curbs on drugs, and I think Mexico has to pay a bigger price. Close the border? Well, I think the first thing, Rubio said a couple days ago, the first thing you go after is anybody in the U.S. who's been convicted of a felony. Anyone who's been convicted of a felony has to go. You know, do we go a lot further to the dreamers? I don't know. Let's see how moderate Republicans react to this. I think moderate Republicans might worry that we've overdone it. But yeah, I'll leave it at that.
You mentioned, all these factors that go in. We have inflation.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that well. Say again.
You've mentioned, inflation, high taxes, high spending, or lower taxes, high spending. And you touched on immigration, and kind of touching on hers, we have a border problem, but I believe it's almost half of our agriculture workers are undocumented, and they pay in, the last estimate I heard was like around 80 to maybe $90 billion a year. They don't receive benefits. These are people that are actually working. Now, if we deport those people, and we've got all these other factors, there is a big difference between Wall Street and people who own stocks and get dividends such as us, and then Main Street, the people that are complaining about the price of eggs and groceries and they can't make it, and their wages are suppressed. How is that going to play into everything else that's going on with our economy? How are we going to handle that?
Great point, and I have lots of friends in California who call me up and say, we can't find any workers. We can't find anyone to fix our roof. We can't find anybody to whatever you want to mention. There still is an acute labor shortage. Very, very, very controversial issue. I would think that it may start to become apparent to people that we have run out of labor, and that'll be an interesting point. But going back to your other point, the illegal immigrants who commit crimes, felonies, are going to have to answer to that. That's the new mantra. I think that we're going to get a much tougher environment, and it's going to be with us for a while. You have a lot of questions to answer from these people.
I do. I normally don't do this, but I feel compelled just to respond from a different perspective.
Please.
Before I thank Greg. And one is, as you mentioned, on closing the border. If we look, I encourage you to look at the facts. There are many jobs, including those agricultural workers, that if we close the border, there'll be fewer and fewer workers, which is inflationary.
Yep.
Just by the nature of it. That's the fact. So if you close the border, be prepared for more inflation. Because you have less workers creating food for this economy. Second of all, thank you, artificial intelligence. So far, as Greg mentioned, they're during the honeymoon period right now. But next year, please don't be surprised if investors start to hold those investors that are throwing billions or hundreds of billions of dollars towards artificial intelligence, if they start holding those spenders, those investors, accountable. In other words, all that money's being spent, it has not yet been determined and answered. When will money be made? How much money will be made? What is the exact return on investment? It's interesting that people are throwing money at this without knowing what they're going to get back. But we believe there will be a day or a time of reckoning where those questions will need to be answered. And in terms of AI, we feel that our firm takes a different position. We feel that the biggest or largest beneficiaries of artificial intelligence will be the healthcare sector. We're already seeing it right now in biotechnology. So if you want to buy something that's high, go chase artificial intelligence. If you want to find something that's more reasonably priced, suitable to Greg, is look to the healthcare industry that's on sale, comparatively speaking. And thirdly, you talked about crypto. For those of you that knew or remember Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's partner, when you mentioned the word crypto, somehow he typically would respond with the word turds. So that'll tell you his position on it. But I don't know if Dr. Brad Wimmer's here, professor in economics, but he would tell you that anything can go up in price if you have people willing to buy, and there are more buyers than sellers. So literally anything can go up in price. And right now you have a lot more buyers than sellers. So if you believe that's the case, then crypto can make you as much money as anything else. Those are my comments there. So thank you for allowing me to share those with you. I'd like to thank Greg Valliere for a highly informative peek into what may be in store for us for the next 4 years and beyond. I'd like to thank Senator Bryan. And Senator Bryan has just published a book on memoirs. We have a few left in the back, and for those of you that if we run out, we'd be happy to take your names, and we'd be sure to forward you copies of his book, courtesy of our firm. And I'd like to thank General Greg Eide once again. And most importantly, I'd like to thank you, our guest, for attending this evening. I wish you safe travels home, and this concludes our presentation this evening. Thank you so much.
That was a great finish. Great finish.